Hey everyone, and welcome to Volume 8 of Horror Stories to Help You Sleep. Tonight we have 6 stories ranging from time travel, the deep woods, and much, much more. I do have a huge announcement really fast. Those of you that have been around for a while probably remember when I was practicing my voice. It didn't work out on this channel for a number of reasons. It's nobody's fault, and I get it. However, I have received a ton of comments from people saying that they miss when I narrated stories the way that I like to. And I have decided to open up another channel by the name of Miss Tara, where I will be posting horror stories every couple of days in my preferred voice. So if you would like to go subscribe to it, I will have it linked in the description as well as the pinned comment. I have one video posted over there so far, but I'm going to be filling up that channel very, very rapidly. I'm super reluctant to call it a second channel. I would just call it another channel because I'm going to be working on that channel just as hard as I do on this one. Nothing will be changing on Slumber Reads whatsoever, so if you are not interested in the other channel, that's okay. You can just keep listening to this one. But I would really, really love to see some familiar faces over there as well. I have a goal of reaching 20,000 subscribers over there this year. I think it's possible. Like I said, I'm going to be putting in a lot of work, and it'll be very valuable practice for me. So even if the channel isn't super successful or whatever, it's still very much worth it to me. But I think it'd be a fun journey to take you guys with me on. Anyway, I think that's pretty much everything. Please, please, please go at least check it out. I would really appreciate it. Let's get into the stories. If you enjoy tonight's video, please be sure to drop a like as it helps out immensely. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated as I post content just like this all of the time. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Here, your new mittens are done. These ought to serve you well after yesterday's snowstorm left the entire countryside covered in snow. You'll have to bundle up well if you want to go play outside, my older sister said right after she finished knitting me a pair of mittens. Knitting clothes had been her specialty for as long as I could remember. I'll never forget the time she grabbed a pile of spare wool and crafted an adorable sheep costume for me to wear in our village's Mardi Gras costume party. In fact, knitting clothes and selling them on commission or at the village's market was one of our family's main sources of income. And by our family, I only mean my older sister and I, since we were the only ones that were left, being 19 and 9 years old respectively. During its greatest extent, our household had consisted of 5 people: my father, my mother, my older brother, my older sister and I, the youngest child and second daughter, and I would see it gradually shrink before my eyes across my 9 years of continued existence. My mother was the first one to go. My father and her attempted to bring another child to the world when I was only 2 years old, but something went wrong in the process, causing her to fall terribly ill and pass away a few weeks afterwards. My father was the next one. He left home when I was 7 years old alongside a large number of other men, as our emperor had called them all to go to Russia, and he never came back. Lastly, my 16-year-old brother had left us only a few months ago. Not unlike my father, he had also been called by our emperor. Only this time, it was to join him on a daring campaign to defend our country from an impending invasion by a coalition of other nations we were at war with. So I bundled up by putting on my new pair of mittens, as well as a thick and fluffy fur coat that covered my entire body from the top of my shoulders to the end of my legs, and lastly, a long woolen scarf, which my sister had also knitted for me in the past, that I wrapped around my head, covering it as well as my ears and neck. After getting properly dressed to face the low temperatures, I joyfully said goodbye to my sister and stepped outside my house, ready to spend that chilly December afternoon having fun in my snow-coated humble little village, tucked away at the edge of a relatively dense and remote forest. I loved playing and roaming around my village and its surroundings, especially now that the first snowfalls had arrived and had blanketed everything in a dense layer of white snow that made the environment twice as beautiful. My favorite place to spend my leisure time in was the forest right beside the village. It had such a magical feeling to it. A bustling sea of towering trees teeming with life, wonder, beauty, and endless possibilities for fun and adventure, practically begging to be explored from top to bottom by children such as myself. I happily roamed the woods playing with the snow, trying to count how many wild animals such as hares or birds I could spot, and skipping around while pretending to be a fairy. After about an hour of aimlessly roaming around and enjoying myself in a plethora of different ways, I eventually decided to follow a narrow trail that I had never explored before, and that led me deeper and deeper into the forest, until I stumbled upon something that had left me puzzled. It was a tunnel, a man-made one made out of stone bricks and concrete. What was a tunnel doing in the middle of a forest? It was about 50 meters long. The other end of the tunnel could barely be seen from where I was standing in, but the space in between the two extremes was shrouded in darkness. It didn't seem to lead anywhere, as the only thing that could be seen on the other side was just more woodland. According to my grandpa, the ruins should be nearby, said an echoing voice as I was still perplexingly staring at the mysterious tunnel and theorizing about its reason for existing. It sounded like the voice was coming from inside the tunnel itself. The voice from the tunnel was soon joined by the sound of continuous footsteps and other murmuring voices that were getting increasingly louder and clearer with each passing second. It was clear the people from the tunnel were getting closer. 3 silhouettes emerged from the shadowy tunnel. They appeared to be children, 2 boys and a girl to be exact. All of them looked to be about the same age as me, but as the mysterious kids and I simultaneously and silently stared at each other for a few seconds, I couldn't help but notice several details about them that felt rather off, mainly concerning their appearance and the clothes they wore. I recognized their outfits as winter gear: coats, scarves, hats, and gloves. However, the materials, the textures, and overall design of their clothes were unlike any I had ever seen. Is that a girl?" One of the boys whispered to the other 2 kids under his breath as I quietly stared at them from a few feet away without moving a muscle. "Yeah, I think so. What's she doing here, though? And what's the deal with her weird clothes?" The other boy replied, "I don't know. Maybe we should talk to her." The girl of the group suggested. It was then when I noticed yet another oddity. The way they spoke. I could understand them well enough to recognize their language as my own and hold a conversation with them with relative ease, but still, their mannerisms and vocabulary contained several words and expressions that were completely foreign to me. "Hi, are you lost?" the girl said to me, taking a step forward and waving with her gloved hands at me. Hello. No, I live in a nearby village and I visit this forest quite frequently, as a matter of fact." I uttered back after thinking it through for a couple seconds. "Excuse me, but has anyone in your village ever heard about fashion? No offense, but you kind of look like an old lady, with that antiquated fur coat you're wearing and that oversized scarf you've got wrapped around your head. Have you ever posted a picture of yourself dressed like this to social media? Because you would gain quite a few followers for sure," one of the boys exclaimed. I wanted to reply, but ultimately decided to keep silent after processing what the boy had said and realizing I had only understood the part where he had called me an old lady and had made fun of my clothes. But as for the rest of the things that had left his lips, I hadn't understood a thing. Social media, posting pictures of myself, gaining followers. What in the world was he talking about? Who were those kids? Where'd they come from? Come on, guys, don't be rude. It's okay, I think you look great. I'm Emily, and these are Lewis and Mathis. you want to be our friends?" The girl comforted me as she put her hand on my shoulder. "I'm Juliet." I introduced myself and accepted Emily's friendship proposal. As odd as they were, there weren't many children my age I could play with at the village, so it was nice to finally have someone I could spend my afternoons with. I came back home later that evening feeling quite rejoiced, as my new friends and I had plenty of fun playing in the forest. As odd as I had initially found them to be, they turned out to be pretty nice once I actually got to know them. So much so that we had accorded to meet the following day at the same spot we first found each other. That ominous tunnel they had come from in the middle of the woods. But right when I approached our bed, as my sister and I sleep together in the same large bed that had once belonged to our parents, I noticed an odd piece of paper under the pillow, which I identified as a note upon closer inspection. "Be wary of those who have slipped through the tunnel of time, for they are potential sources of chaos that will be put down without mercy if necessary. Signed, Tunnel Keepers." The note read. "What are you reading, Juliet?" My sister asked upon entering our bedroom. "A note I found under the pillow," I replied. "A note? Has our brother finally sent us correspondence from the front?" My sister asked again, briefly letting out a smile of pure joy at the thought of hearing from our brother for the first time in months. I shook my head and her face expression briefly changed to one of disappointment before morphing back into one of intrigue. "It's not from our brother. It's from some strangers who apparently call themselves the Tunnel Keepers. Here, you should see it for yourself. Should we be worried?" I said to her before handing her the note. The Tunnel Keepers. I honestly have no idea who those people could be. I'll look into it tomorrow, Juliet. But now it's time to go to bed. It's pretty late already. Good night. My sister replied after reading the note, seemingly sweeping it under the rug rather quickly, as she fell asleep in less than 10 minutes of laying in bed, but I certainly didn't, as the thought of that note, its mystery, and its implications persistently refused to leave my mind and let me sleep. Could those so-called tunnel keepers be related to the mysterious tunnel I had come across in the middle of the woods? Could they be related to Emily, Lewis, and Mathis? I was unsure of the latter, but their name made their connection with the tunnel from the forest seem almost obvious. Still, it was clear I couldn't come to any substantial conclusions just yet, as I needed more information in order to be able to formulate valid hypothesis. The next day arrived. After spending the whole morning at the village's market selling pieces of cloth alongside my sister and after having lunch, I headed to the forest in order to meet with Emily, Lewis, and Mathis, just as we had accorded the previous day, but with the added feeling of lingering uneasiness product of the ominous note I had found in my bed. This omnipresent disturbance only increased once I came across a fallen tree right in the middle of the narrow pathway that led to the tunnel, actively blocking my path, which was odd, since it was the only tree that had fallen among the dozens of trees that surrounded that narrow trail, and the other trees did not show any signs of damage either. Only that one tree, which just so happened to have fallen in the right position so as to represent an obstacle in my path to the tunnel. I started at the fallen tree and thought about it for a few seconds. And then I remembered Emily, Lewis, and Mathis were waiting for me. So I kept the memory of the fallen tree in the back of my mind, jumped over it, and pressed on towards the tunnel. "Juliet, we're over here." I heard Emily, Lewis, and Mathis excitedly shout from right outside the tunnel. "Hello again. What game do you want to play today?" I joyfully asked as I approached them. "Actually, we want to do the thing that we wanted to do when we came here yesterday that we never ended up doing because we found you and forgot about it. You see, we originally came to the forest because we're looking for the ruins of an abandoned village that several grown-ups we know have told us about. According to the local stories, the village used to be located somewhere near these woods, Some people speculate that its residents abandoned it due to a war, but no one really knows for sure what happened to it, Emily explained. An abandoned village near the forest? How come I've never heard of it before? The village I live in is located right next to the woods, but it's not abandoned. I live there. My sister lives there, and over 200 people live there. I can show it to you if you want to, I said. And thus, Emily, Lewis, Mathis, and I headed to my village, bypassing the mysterious fallen tree along the way. To say they were impressed by the village would be a severe understatement. They followed me across the village, all the while carrying facial expressions of complete wonder as they fixedly stared at everything around them. And they weren't the only ones, as practically every villager we'd pass by would also stare at my friends with the same fascination. Noticing this, I decided to discreetly lead them to my house and lend them clothes that had once belonged to my older sister and older brother, back when they had been my age, in order for them to not draw as much attention to themselves. Oh, by the way, I also want to show you this. I found it under my pillow yesterday. I told them as I showed them that weird note from the previous day written by those so-called tunnel keepers. These tunnel keepers, I bet they're related to the tunnel from the forest. Lewis' son. Well, duh. I'm more worried about the people they talk about. The ones who slipped through the tunnel of time, as they put it. I think they're talking about us three. Mathis replied at Lewis, and Emily started to get visibly worried. But what do these creepy strangers want from us? I'm getting scared, guys. Maybe we should go home already. It's almost dinner time. Emily suggested. Everyone unanimously agreed, and so Emily, Lewis, and Mathis left my home and village and headed back into the woods where they had come from as I was left home alone thinking about the mystery of the tunnel keepers for a short while before my sister finally arrived home from the village's market. As my sister and I were getting ready to have dinner, I found a small and familiar piece of paper randomly laying on the floor right under the table. My heart rate started to go up as I slowly approached it and picked it up. Just as I was dreading, another note. You let the sources of chaos in, and now you've become a source of chaos yourself. Therefore, we'll proceed to do what must be done. We'll make sure those who you've recently sent home shall not cross the tunnel alive. Signed, Tunnel Keepers. Wait, Juliet, where are you going? Don't you want to eat dinner? My sister asked in confusion as I frantically bundled up and rushed outside. It was a shame because my sister had made fried onion for dinner, and I loved onion. I loved onion fried in oil because it tasted good. I'm fine. I'll be back in a moment, I promise. I exclaimed to her before I sprinted to the forest, determined to help my friends and save them from whoever those tunnel keepers were. Juliet! Juliet! Emily shouted as she ran towards me, her eyes soaked in tears. Emily, what happened? Where are Lewis and Mathis? I worryingly asked, noticing her despair. We were about to enter the tunnel and go home, but then a group of monsters came out of it and I ran, but Lewis and Mathis didn't react quick enough and they ate them. The tunnel keepers. They jumped at them and swallowed them both right in front of me. They're coming. They're coming for us, Juliet. Emily uttered in between sobs as she broke into tears. It didn't take long before I spotted them in the distance. There were at least 20 of them. Their elongated bodies swiftly dragged themselves across the forest while staying low to the ground with the help of a pair of long and thin extremities that sported 2 huge claws each. A pair of pointy protuberances on their heads looked to be their ears. As for their faces, they had 2 bright glowing yellow eyes and nothing else. They seemed to have no mouths or noses to speak of. Emily and I rushed back to the village as the tunnel keepers crawled towards us. They seemed to be slower than us, allowing us to reach the village with a slight time margin we could use to warn everybody. But they kept pursuing us relentlessly nonetheless. "Monsters! Monsters, help!" Emily and I shouted across the street. The commotion caught the attention of the village's small garrison of Imperial troops, which came to us to find out the cause behind our sudden warnings. "They're coming to the village. We're in danger. We need to hide," I nervously told the soldiers. "Easy there, kid. Who's coming? An enemy army? Is it the Russians or the Austrians, perhaps? I need more information, young lady." The garrison's captain replied, "They're not humans. They're monsters. Big, scary, and dangerous monsters. I'm telling the truth, I swear." I clarified, feeling so tense I could almost feel my blood boiling inside my veins. The captain responded with a silent and smug smirk, clearly not taking my words seriously, but he admitted he had nothing to lose for playing along, so I convinced him to pull out a spyglass and check the forest out from a distance. His face expression of mockery instantly turned into one of utter shock and horror once he spotted the horde of tunnel keepers emerging from the woods. My God, I can hardly believe it, but I'm afraid the kid is somehow right. We need to tell all villagers to dig in and prepare themselves for an attack. I have no idea what in the world those disgusting creatures could possibly be, but we must have courage and defend our people. We'll gather at the main gate and deny them entrance to the village by all means necessary. Understood? Now go. Long live France. Long live the Emperor," the captain exclaimed as he rallied his small force of 50 soldiers, mostly made up of young conscripts, much like my older brother, that were almost certainly just as terrified as Emily and I were, and rushed to the village's main gate to intercept the tunnel keepers. The garrison outnumbered the monsters and did not hesitate to increasingly shoot volley after volley of musket balls and grenades at them, but they seemed to inflict no significant damage, as the creatures aggressively pounced at the line of troops, catching 15 soldiers at once and consuming them by slowly and painfully absorbing them as if the creatures' enormous bodies and skins suddenly lost consistency and solidity and became something akin to quicksand, swallowing their poor victims whole as they screamed and helplessly struggled to liberate themselves to no avail, their desperate cries for help being abruptly silenced as they vanished into the tunnel keepers' stomachs in a matter of seconds, never to be seen again. Upon witnessing their comrades' demise, the garrison's captain immediately ordered a retreat as his line disintegrated into a chaotic mob of horrified and traumatized young men fleeing for their lives. The tunnel keepers swept through each street one by one, effortlessly crushing the few brave souls who had dared to make a stand behind the numerous, improvised, and extremely rudimentary barricades scattered across the village. Most villagers, including Emily, my sister, and I, gathered at the village's square and hid inside the church. The square was, by far, the most well-defended area of the village, with a line of trenches reinforced by wooden fences and parapets made out of piled-up sandbags. Among the defenders were most of the village's adult male population alongside what remained of the Imperial garrison, including its captain. Despite literally throwing away their lives for our village, the defenders only managed to hold the line for less than 2 minutes before the trenches were overrun, and most defenders were consumed by the tunnel keepers, as the women, children, and the battered remnants of the force that attempted to defend the trenches could do nothing but cower inside the church, which the tunnel keepers besieged as they climbed up its walls like spiders and shattered its windows. As a last resort to preserve the village's most valuable lives, it was agreed to evacuate all the children through the church's back door, as every man and woman that could hold a gun would make a final stand in a suicide mission to distract the tunnel keepers and buy enough time for the children to escape safely. "Don't cry, my little sister. I'll always be watching over you, as long as you never forget about me. All right, my dear?" My sister comforted me as we gave each other one last hug with our faces soaked in tears. I love you. I shouted at her as Emily and I left the church, and my sister picked up a musket laying on the floor and armed herself like the other adults, preparing to sacrifice themselves and engage the tunnel keepers head on. The tunnel. We need to get to the tunnel and cross through it, Emily said as we both ran into the woods. I briefly looked back at the village, only to find a pair of tunnel keepers had abandoned their piers and were now chasing us across the forest at full speed. Run faster. Run faster, I exclaimed to Emily as we approached the infamous tunnel. We entered the tunnel without a second thought, with the tunnel keepers on our heels. It was so dark I couldn't see a thing. Not the other end of the tunnel, not Emily running right beside me, not the tunnel keepers pursuing us. Nothing. It was all pitch black. But I could still hear everything very clearly. Emily's footsteps and heavy breathing as well as my own. And of course, the tunnel keeper's heavy footsteps that intensely reverberated across the tunnel's walls and ceiling. I could hear them getting closer and closer and closer. Then Emily screamed as the sound of her footsteps in coordination with mine abruptly ceased. It happened so fast I didn't have time to fully process it, so I kept running, as exhausted as I was, without slowing down, without looking back. I needed to reach the exit of that hellish tunnel or die trying. As I desperately gasped for air and dropped to my knees after finally having reached the other end of the tunnel, I was overwhelmed by a sudden and uncomfortable silence. The tunnel keepers that had been chasing me so relentlessly did not come out of the tunnel to continue to pursue me, and vanished without a trace. The distant screams coming from the village had also ceased. Everything had mysteriously stopped. I was suddenly all alone in the middle of the woods, surrounded by nature, peace, and quiet that didn't really make me feel peaceful at all. After spending a considerable amount of time thinking about what I should do, I ultimately decided to head back to the village, in hopes of finding any survivors and finding my older sister specifically. Instead, the sight I was met with upon reaching the place I used to call home left me with such a feeling of inner emptiness and devastation I can hardly put it into words. But to put it simply, that place was not a village anymore. An extremely deteriorated wall or two stood, as well as the outline of their foundations barely visible in the ground, was all that remained of most houses, with some having completely collapsed and having become nothing more than a pile of rubble. The pavement on the streets had been buried under several layers of mud, moss, and weeds, and the town square and church had been almost entirely taken over by brambles and bushes. Was that a dirty, withered musket hidden beneath the tall grass? Were those bones and skulls scattered inside the overgrown, derelict church? Was that a pine tree surrounded by debris and a couple crumbling walls growing in the exact same place my house used to be? It was apparent the tunnel keepers alone could not have been responsible for the village's current state. It did not look like a village that had just been raided and deserted less than an hour prior. It looked like a village that had been completely abandoned, forgotten, and rotting away for a really, really long time, to the point it had been enveloped by vegetation and assimilated into the forest itself. I aimlessly trudged down a long road I had come across after exiting the woods, and what was left of my old village. Traumatized, fatigued, cold, and homeless as tears poured down my eyes like waterfalls, and my teeth began to chatter due to being exposed to the frigid winter air out in the open in the middle of the night. I was suddenly blinded by an intense light that emanated from a pair of glowing orbs belonging to a creature that advanced towards me at an alarming speed. At first, I thought the tunnel keepers were back, but I was wrong. That thing was an entirely different being I had never seen before. It emitted a constant roaring noise as it rolled down the road with wheels similar to that of a carriage. but it moved autonomously without being pulled by any horses or any animal whatsoever. It also seemed to constantly release an odd gas of some kind. My brain instructed me to run away, but my body had already been physically and psychologically pushed to its absolute limit. I couldn't take it anymore, so I responded to the new threat by dropping to the ground and losing consciousness. When I woke up, I was no longer in the same place I had fainted in. No longer in the middle of a road out in the open, but indoors. Laying on a bed beside a room mostly painted white and filled with all sorts of strange appliances I did not recognize. "Oh, you are awake. Hello, how are you feeling?" said a young woman wearing a white coat as she walked into the room. I did not answer her. Instead, I just silently stared at her while raising an eyebrow in confusion. "It's all right, sweetheart. You're in a hospital and I'm the nurse that's been assigned to take care of you. My name's Anne. It's wonderful to meet you. A truck driver brought you here. He said he'd found you alone in the middle of the road and that he nearly ran you over. Thankfully, he was able to react in time and hit the brakes at the last second. But you fainted right afterwards, so he decided to collect you and bring you here. You've been unconscious for about 2 hours. Why don't you tell me a bit about yourself? What's your name? Where are you from? Is there any grown-up you know and trust who we can reach out to?" The nurse said after noticing how lost I was. My name's Juliet, and I have no clue where I'm from. I used to know it, but that was a very long time ago. My home is gone. My family is gone. My friends are gone. Everything I've ever known is gone. I don't feel like talking about it right now." I faintly and sobbingly uttered, using what little energy and willpower I had left. "I see. Don't worry, Juliet. You're tired and cold, but you can take all the time to recover you need. I'm here for you." Anne replied in a soft, motherly tone before she wrapped me in a blanket and started feeding me a bowl of hot soup. What followed was several minutes of silence during which Anne fed me a spoonful of soup after another as I curled up to her swaddled from top to bottom in a bulky white blanket. With neither of us saying a word, my mind was too busy processing all I had been through that day to talk. The more I remembered, the soggier my eyes got, and the harder it got to contain my urge to burst into tears. "It's completely all right, dear. You can cry all you want. Don't hold back," Anne gently whispered to me. It was then that I let everything out and cried on her lap like I had never cried before as she wrapped her arms around my torso in a long, comforting embrace for what felt like ages. I cried for my sister, for my village, for Emily, Lewis, and Mathis. I cried because they had all died 200 years ago, and they were never going to come back. I cried because the tunnel keepers had taken everything away from me. A lot has happened since I first crossed the tunnel that fateful evening of 1813 and emerged in 2013. I've since grown into a teenager that's more or less gotten accustomed to the modern world. I've gotten a new home, a new family, new friends, the chance to go to school, to learn foreign languages, and to dream of someday going to college and becoming a historian. All thanks to Anne, who I now have the joy to call my adoptive mother. But still, that feeling of dread has never fully disappeared. I'm aware the tunnel keepers have not gone away. I can still feel them. I can feel the nightmares and hear the villagers' screams every time I go to sleep. I know they still see me as a source of chaos that has slipped through the tunnel of time. Because deep down, I know that's what I am. And I know they'll come for me. Restoring order is their duty. It's just a matter of time before I find their next note under the pillow. After all, they have all the time in the world. I have no use for age anymore, but I know I was 10 when it started. My mother came into my room to say goodnight as she always did, pulling the covers all the way up to my chin and tucking them around my miniature frame. A bear hug and a kiss on both cheeks, and a final reaffirmation that there is no one on this earth she could possibly love more than me. Our routine complete, she tugged the cord to my bedside lamp, extinguishing the stars that twinkled on its shade from the lit bulb, and followed the light spilling in from the hallway, pulling the door closed on her way out. Just before it clicked shut, she peered back over her shoulder, smiling at what I'm sure was a charming image. Me. So innocent in the world and pure of heart, peering over the blanket to catch one final glimpse, to assure me she should see me in the morning. With those final words, the door would click shut, and I was surrendered to the darkness. It was in the stillness of that night, 10 years old, protected from the cold by my mother's warmth, it dawned on me that I would never again feel her embrace. I knew, without a doubt in my mind, that I had just seen my mother for the last time. Surely I could fling off the covers my mother so purposefully wrapped me in, throw open the door and tear down the hall shouting her name. I'd find her most likely in her bedroom doing some light reading before she, too, turned in for the night. She'd console me, stroking my hair in such a way that would instantly put me at ease, before walking me back to bed, insisting that she would be just down the hall. But in that moment, I found myself unable to move. An impossible cold had overtaken me, akin to the cold of a winter's night so dreadful it takes a scalding hot shower or hours entombed in blankets to fully return feeling to one's body. The feeling of never being warm again. Even amidst the horrible realization, I was unable to stave off the tide of sleep, my eyes growing heavier as I became colder, the weight of my sarcophagus of blankets betraying me to the point of suffocation. That night I dreamed of her, a vicious parade of what I somehow understood to her memories. Lies told, fights with loved ones, buried secrets, hateful looks, anything and everything monumentous or incidental alike. A carousel of the dregs of her subconscious, funneled directly to me in unrelenting succession. I awoke in the morning with a crushing weight in my chest as if my mother had been relinquished of her transgressions and, in turn, the burden was forced into my own heart. Free from my invisible bonds, I approached her room to find her laying peacefully in bed. Her body cold, a social worker would later explain to me, very delicately, that a previously undetected problem with her heart had resulted in her sudden demise. But at least she passed in her sleep, they would say, as if a positive takeaway was even possible. The sentiment was appreciated, though it was lost on me as a child, painlessly, in her sleep. Why was she allowed to leave this world peacefully with a young child in the wake of her passing? For years, I tortured myself, unable to relinquish the darkness weighing down my heart. Endlessly, I speculated how, if maybe, just maybe, she was awake when it had happened, she would have thought of me. And maybe, just maybe, the thought of leaving her only child alone in this world might have kept her alive. But I'd felt it when she closed my door that night. I knew there was nothing to be done. That was the first time. In the beginning, it was impossible to grapple with this new reality, compounded by the fact that I was alone in my curse. Or maybe there were others and, much like me, they were simply too afraid to talk about it. Either way, I was alone. But as with all things, I settled into this new reality, continuing on as best I could. After a while, it became predictable, mostly after visiting elderly relatives. At least I could brace for the potential and the inevitable, which somehow began to offer the smallest shred of comfort. I learned quickly that not every experience was personal, though that didn't change what followed. The cold, the dreams, the memories, the sin, the weight, the death, the helplessness. Each piece worked in tandem, each as bad as the last. Some were much worse, saying goodbye to a friend after a night out, dead from choking on their own vomit. A young child down the street, working on his dribbling. They never caught the driver who hit him, and then from that pain being forced to relive the child's sins that very night, stealing Halloween candy when his friend wasn't looking, pulling the hair of a girl he had a crush on. It was enough to ruin me. I had no choice but to become completely desensitized, if only to find some way to cope with the reality of bearing witness. The worst was having to pretend I didn't know. But I had already started to grieve when someone called to tell me the news, because the night before a dying soul bled their humanity out to me. That I'd exhausted my tears years ago thinking about how I could stop it from happening. If only I could pick up the phone or pound on their front door until they had no choice but to answer. That I knew how to save myself, but simply couldn't. I thought of my friends and family, random passerby, even my mother. I thought of all of them, so fortunate to be blissfully unaware of our final parting while I absorbed their dormant sin. Would they believe me if I told them? Would they change their actions, cancel their plans, and wrap themselves in a sarcophagus of blankets until I no longer felt the cold in my heart? Would that even change the outcome? It was as if, in my final moment with them, the cold took it upon itself to absorb all of their negative energy, to leave them free of burden, free of sin, free of everything. But that weight could not be destroyed, only transferred to me. Eventually it became too much, and I gave up on any connection to the outside world. I had already made my plan, just as my mother had so many years before. I wanted to go peacefully in my sleep. I cut ties with my friends and family, and it was then I began to feel the cold. Only this time it was different. I was making the conscious decision that I would never see them again. For a brief moment, I was in control. The cold lingered as I prepared myself for what was to come, and for a week I slept, subjected to a ceaseless procession of everything those closest to me wanted to hide from the world. I emerged. My chest contracted from the weight inside. 100 lifetimes worth of pain added on top of an already unbearable mass. For the cold, it must have been a feast. On the chosen day, I stood in the bathroom and stared at the bottle of pills on the counter, assuring myself it was truly what I wanted. A glimpse of my reflection in the mirror repulsed me. My skin was nearly translucent, my face gaunt, the bags under my eyes deep. I felt empty, everything left in me, siphoned off by the cold to a rotting heart burdened with the affliction of others. I felt like a ghost. Resigned to my fate, I reached for the bottle, still resting on the counter. At least, in my mind, I did. No matter how hard I tried, my hand would not move. I stood there white-knuckling the edge of the sink, gritting my teeth, tears blurring my vision as I cried for the first time in years. But I could not pick up the bottle. I looked in the mirror for once in my life, wishing more than anything that I would feel the cold again, that I could allow myself to die. I tried for what seemed like hours, but it would not come. In the wake of my inability to end my own life, as I collapsed into a crumpled heap on the floor of my bathroom, I realized the full extent of my curse. With the knowledge of my planned death, I had cut myself off from everyone, forcing myself to see them for the last time under the assumption it wouldn't matter when I was dead. But I lived on. When I was finally able to pull myself off of the floor, the tile greased with my sweat and tears, I knew there was nothing to be done. Too burdened by the weight, I could not pass on, no matter how much it pained me to remain. A heart too heavy to bear judgment could not be silenced, ever beating despite my wishes. This time, no one called. In fact, I surmised no one would ever call again. In my arrogance, I had foolishly believed I could control my power to free myself, but what came of it was more death than my soul could comprehend. I had removed myself from their lives, taking all pain and leaving them free of burden, free of sin, free of everything, free of me. I had prepared them for the afterlife, and now my job was complete. In that moment, trapped in the agony of oblivion, I wrestled with what led me to this moment. I thought of the relatives, the friends, the strangers who foretold deaths I felt. I thought of everyone I let go of prematurely, believing it was a means to an end. I thought of a 10-year-old child, their mother kissing them on each cheek for what they would soon learn was the last time. And again I wondered if there were others like me, if they would ever find me, huddled on the bathroom tile, unable to die, or if they were doomed to suffer the same fate. I thought of my mother and how glad I was she wasn't awake when she passed. I wondered what her last thought was before she went to sleep, unburdened by the knowledge that she'd never wake up, a fate I was not fortunate enough to receive. For here in the darkness, I found that which I have denied myself for so long. Fear. I had spent most of my life disconnected from most emotion to shoulder the weight, but with no end in sight, I was forced to realize that nothing could save me now. Fear is the only thing I have felt as my heart beats on despite my wishes, unable to live or die. I sit perfectly still, heart too heavy to bear, praying for a final judgment that will never come. It's so hard to breathe. I have no idea how long it's been or how old I am. All I know is I was 10 when it started. I hope her last thought was of me. The road signs are different at night. It's something my mom used to say all the time. She said it when I was a child in the back seat, and she said it when she was teaching me how to drive. Every stretch of highway or back road turn was different under the veil of darkness. I laughed at the concept at first, thinking maybe she was overreacting a little. I just got my license and I had driven many times before, but they had all been convenient, daylight drives in the past. I thought surely as long as I had a GPS and working headlights, everything would be fine. In the end, her words rang true, and it was something I learned the hard way. My 18th birthday was 2 months ago. I was working a part-time day shift job as a dishwasher at a country club since I had graduated high school. It wasn't a bad job and it taught me the value of earning and appreciating your paycheck. I found that despite my hate for school, I actually enjoyed working and making money to provide for myself instead of just hanging around and existing. My mom or my sister would pick me up after work in the family beater, an old Dodge Intrepid, so they could run errands and whatnot while I was at work. We didn't have a lot of money and I was helping out around the house with what I made as a dishwasher. But that all changed when I ran into my cousin at the country club. He had offered me a job, making twice as much where he worked. My cousin Scott was a steel worker. It sounded exciting to me at the time. A dangerous job, farther away from home than I was used to. Lots of overtimes and bigger checks. I didn't have any plans for college and I didn't have anything else lined up employment-wise. So it seemed like a lifeline when he offered it to me. It would be my first big boy job. And I couldn't help but think of the dollar signs swirling around my head. "It'll be good for you," he said. "You can get an early start, make some good money, try to get things on track, make it through probation, and you'll have a steady job to hunker down at for a bit." After an application, a ride to a job interview, and a drug test, I was on my way to doing just that. I would start as a laborer, doing grunt work, and when a bid came up, I might have a chance to move into something a little more concrete. I put in my notice at the dish pit, bought some steel toe boots, and some heavy cargos to wear until uniforms came in, and finished my 2 weeks with impatience. I would start out on second shift, working 3 to 11, and probably get forced into some overtime, but I was cool with it. Once my notice was up, I said goodbye to the friends I had made at the country club, and got ready for bigger and better things. With a new job starting, my mom said I would take the Intrepid myself, just in case I had to work way later than scheduled. She was worried about being out so late, and more importantly, driving at night. The mill was in a port 20 miles away, whereas my previous job was just down the road. There were only 2 ways to get there: the expressway that would get me there faster, or the back road that went through the dunes that led to the port. My mother said the highway was out of the question, too many crazy people on the roads, and the fact I had never driven at night made her very uncomfortable. She said I would take the scenic route. It was covered in trees and traffic was light, and I would be fine as long as I watched for deer. I was nervous and excited, but before I knew it, I was on my way for my first day. I plugged my phone into the aux cord since my phone was an old hand-me-down. I had to find a sweet spot for it to come in clearly. I set my GPS and put on some music and started the heavily wooded cruise. On my way to work, the drive was beautiful. The trees were tall and danced in the wind, rays of sunshine shining down all the way to the port. It was a more touristy route, I suppose, being so close to the lake. Gift shops and gas stations could be seen every couple miles, and there were several elderly men taking their project cars out for a Sunday drive on a Monday. At the halfway point in my drive, I caught a red light. The intersection was small, and with an old train station next to it with a sign that read, "Sandy Shores." There was a couple on a bench outside the station, cheesy smiles beaming as they posed for a selfie. It all seemed so serene, this beautiful drive, on the way to my much more profitable job, seeing these nice cars that maybe one day I would be able to afford. I looked forward to making this drive in the days to come, with my tunes playing on the stereo, nice easy speed limit, and lazily listing turns. I found my way to work and got to my first day. The port itself was the farthest thing from beautiful. It seemed like a decaying hole in the land. Nothing but dusty gravel, loud semi-trucks, and loud bangs echoing from the factories on every corner. I parked next to the other soot-covered cars and headed in. After getting my own hard hat and shown around, I was led to my station, where I would spend the next 8 hours putting bands on stacks of plate and verifying skid tickets. Some people were rougher than others, but the night crew seemed to be more populated with a younger crew, so I blended in just fine. I ended up with a guy named Terry, someone a few years older than me, who showed me the ropes and made sure I was out of people's way. He was a pretty cool guy, hardworking and priding himself in being an overtime hog. The job was a little stressful, but the banter in between packaged loads made it a little easier. Despite the intimidation of the overhead cranes and loud, percussion of the machines, I focused on the tasks at hand and doing the best I could. I wanted to impress management so I wouldn't get axed during my probation. The days seemed to fly by. Halfway through the shift, the supervisor let me know Terry and I were getting low-manned to stay over a few hours after the shift to pick up the warehouse. Something about cleaning up to install cameras for the line. Terry was pleased and said he would have volunteered anyway. It was seniority-based overtime, so if I wanted to keep my job, I didn't really have a choice. Even though the shift was extended, it went pretty quick. The labor was way less monotonous than doing dishes all day. I was told I could wrap it up for the day and head home. Terry said he would stay and try to milk it a little longer. And after a fist bump, I punched out and it was time to go home. I was feeling extremely accomplished and optimistic. That wasn't until I got to the parking lot. It was dark outside. Very dark. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for my car, Terry's, and the supervisor's. Out in the port, the air was chillier and more eerie than back home. It even felt darker, like I didn't belong there. Trying to maintain my high spirits, I walked to my car, which was now covered in the dust that blew around all day. I got in, started it up, and plugged my phone back into the aux so I could hear the GPS and music on my way home. I texted my mom that I was on my way, and after picking a song, I was ready to go. It shouldn't be too bad, I told myself, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, I prepared to cross another milestone in the same day, driving home at night. Leaving the port was just as different at night. Instead of the sun lighting everything up, there was just a row of orange lamps lighting the way out. A few semis were shouldered for the night, drivers that were sleeping to get the jump on the next load first thing in the morning. It seemed so desolate compared to earlier this morning. As I drove through the exit and back on the scenic route that would take me back the way I came, I realized that the orange lights in the port would be the last of my light for a while. Once I left, it was just me on the road, my old beater car chugging away into the night. It wasn't too bad. The visibility was a little worse than I thought, but at least I had the GPS and music. The drive was only a half hour. Before I knew it, I would be back home and showering after the first long day of work. Entering the wooded part of my drive felt like driving into a cave. The tall trees leaning over the road blocking out even the slightest hint of moonlight. I focused on the drive ahead, the worn aux input cackling over the music. Each bump in the road seemed rougher than before, each branch reaching just a little further in the headlights. I white-knuckled the wheel as I drove, feeling silly for being as on edge as I was. It was just a short drive. What was the big deal? Everybody drove at night. People did it all the time. Each winding curve seemed to turn into the same repetitive stretch of trees. Like I was driving through the same segment over and over again. Time seemed to crawl as my car chugged down the road, the high beams reflecting off every sign as I made my way. Old, beat-up signs for no passing. Signs warning of a low shoulder. Signs for deer crossing. I looked at them all one by one, my eyes lingering long on the yellow square with the silhouette of a buck prancing. Watch for deer. To my surprise, there wasn't much to watch out for, except for the trees. Just when I thought I wasn't making any progress, I found myself at the same intersection from earlier, caught at the same red light. I slowed to the inevitable stop and sat waiting, my progressive rock drumming against long-blown speakers. My eyes drifted from the road in front of me to the train station. The sign for Sandy Shores not lit with a flickering neon. The bench with the couple I observed earlier now stood empty under a lamp post, littered with discarded trash from the commuters throughout the day. There wasn't a soul in sight. No other cars, Nobody else making a trek somewhere in the middle of the night. It just felt so dark. I checked the GPS as I sat. I only had 12 minutes until I reached my destination. The drive was practically over already. As I looked down at my phone, I saw the green glow fill the cab as the light changed. I eased off the brake and continued. I thought of the work I did prior, and how my muscles were sore in a way I had never felt before. My joints ached differently, like I had spent all day long rolling down a hill. I thought of a hot shower and washing away the dirt and rust that circulated through the air of the plant as the production line ran. As fulfilled as it made me feel, in the back of my mind I wondered how people did something like that every day for work. I guess I would just get used to it. Ahead I saw a pothole in the headlights glow, one I wouldn't be able to swerve away from in time. The passenger side tire hit it dead center, the impact rocking the entire car on its shot suspension. I winced at the crater in the pavement, and the crackling in the music got worse as the aux lost its sweet spot. The grinding distortion stood my hair up as I reached for the cord, and found nothing but an empty seat. I felt for my phone in the dark, my fingers trying to trail the cord to the source. "Come on," I said, fumbling in the dark. After several attempts, I couldn't quite find the phone, like my hand wasn't making the connection to my brain, what it was supposed to be looking for. I saw the eyes and the reflection of the fur too late, and I slammed on the brakes. The tire squealed as I flew towards the baby deer, my entire body seizing like a frozen statue. I could only squeeze the steering wheel and stomp my foot as hard as I could, unable to totally alter the momentum of the car. I stopped suddenly, but not fast enough. The car screeching to a halt just late enough to smack the fawn with the front bumper. The hit was quick but solid, and I watched in denial as the young animal was tossed off its hooves and tumbled down the road in front of me. I grit my teeth so hard they hurt. I looked at the body dumbfounded. It had happened so fast. There was no way it could just come out of nowhere. I didn't have enough time. Even if I wasn't distracted, there was no way I could have. How was I supposed to? The static was worse through the stereo. My phone lost somewhere in the abyss that was the passenger side floor. The cord had followed it, and it hung from the jack at a sharp angle like a tugged fishing line. I sat there with my jaw hanging, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to think. Before I had the time to even process what had happened ahead of me, another bright shape echoed off the headlights. Another deer with big ears and a shiny coat had walked into the road slowly like it couldn't believe what it was seeing. With hesitant steps, it crossed the pavement, and as I painstakingly watched it nudge the motionless body with its snout, I came to the horrifying conclusion of what I was looking at. Its mother. Ahead of me, the majestic plump doe nudged the still corpse of its child, and as it registered what it had found, promptly erupted in the saddest cries of pain I had ever heard from an animal. With its head whipping around in desperation, it called to the woods surrounding us, its calls echoing through the trees and chilling me to the bone. Its loss, the emotion it felt, was brought on by me, and the guilt washed over me like a smothering plague. I couldn't think. I could only watch. I watched helplessly, wanting to do something, but the cruel realization settled quickly. What could I possibly do other than run down its child? How could I possibly help the situation I had caused? From the passenger floor, my phone struggling against its lack of proper connection. The grinding static was worse and assaulted my ears, but I didn't dare look for my phone now. I could only look ahead at the grieving doe and the child I ran down. Over my convenience of musical reception, I thought about calling someone, maybe calling my mom, but then what? She would be asleep, and when she woke up, there would be a cataclysmic uproar, and even then, I had the only car. It's not like she could come get me. I swallowed hard, and after what felt like an eternity of mulling it over, I decided the only thing my piece of shit self could do in a situation like this, I would try to go around them and drive away. I felt the tears welling in my eyes as my nose started to run as I readjusted my grip. My foot was still stuck against the floor, so I started easing off the brake, committing to my decision to flee. Before I could let off, however, I heard a faint tap on my window. When I turned to my window, my blood went cold. Staring at me through was a giant set of glass-like eyes, belonging to a large 18-point buck. With wide, bulky shoulders, it stood in the entirety of the oncoming lane, lunched down so it could look through my window. Its antlers reached far from the sides of its head, each pronounced point bulbous with velvet. After a deep inhale, it snorted into the chilly air, fogging the glass that seemed so thin under its size. The dark pupils were entrancing and terrifying, like the inside of the car was shrinking under their gaze. I'm sorry. I didn't mean... It just happened. I'm sorry. I mumbled to the large stag, my hands shaking on the wheel. The swirling fear pulled at my gut, and I felt like I was going to piss myself if I didn't look away. For only a second, I looked at the doe and its child in front of me, my sense of fight, wondering if I could chance it and take the shoulder off-road and get past them. The groaning ox continued on the floor, the cord begging to be adjusted or pulled free altogether. I looked to the giant deer in desperation, wanting to apologize more, but knowing it would be useless. Only when it raised its head did I realize it wasn't looking at me, but past me, to the other side of the car. I followed its gaze and saw another of the herd had crept up, a younger male from the looks of it, 2 little velvet points sticking from its head. It investigated the car as it walked up, timidly observing the shape of the car before looking inside. It looked at me, then at the elder, exchanging their unsettling silent glare on opposite sides. As I was caught in the middle, the doe ahead let out another pained wail. The great deer exhaled again, spreading the fog on the window. It tipped its nose to the younger deer, and I watched as it fluttered its ears. The younger one started looking into the car, its head panning the interior as the older one watched. The static on the radio came in and out, like a radio station tuning. After a moment, it paused and stared at something in the dimly lit cab. It didn't make sense to me. On my left, the elder was looking at the same thing. At first, I thought it was the dash, but they weren't looking quite at it. Slowly, I realized it wasn't the glow of the radio they were transfixed on. They were looking at the keys. In a fit of panic, I reached for the switch next to me and locked the doors. A second later, the younger deer lowered its head and hooked one of its nubs on the door handle and jerked up, trying to work the latch. The loud knocks on the handle, slapping, were loud, and I jumped, and the larger deer snorted angrily. It looked at the lock on the windowsill in a way that I could only explain as pure anger. I blindly felt for my phone again and was painfully reminded it was still on the floor. The radio cackled as I fumbled with the cord, and I could swear I could hear words over the frequency. It was barely audible, but I could swear it sounded like, "Let us in." The larger deer stared at me again and without warning smacked its antlers on the window. I jumped at the sound of it and I prayed to God the glass would hold. I looked forward again at any possible route to drive away. With them boxing me in, I would have no chance but to swipe one of them, or run into the mother directly. The larger one smacked the window again, this time busting the velvet. leaving a gritty red splotch on the fogged glass. It drug it across the window, making a dark smear as the bony point scraped along. Ahead, the doe rested its head on its still offspring, its chest heaving with human-like crying. Tears streaked down its fur, and at the sight of it was like I could hear the sobbing. Inside the car, over the radio. Let us in, or let him in. I tried to reach for my phone again. I chanced to glare at the floor, and I could see the outline of it on the floor in the far corner. I gently pulled on the aux cord, and the distortion worsened with every tug, assaulting my ears. I tried to turn off the radio, but it wouldn't work. The volume and source buttons only yielding the same digital error message on the display. The larger deer was rattling its rack against the window faster now, a bleeding mess trailing behind the shredding velvet. The younger deer pressed the side of its face against the passenger side window, its dark eyeball pressing against the glass as it tried to look in as close as it could. The mother deer's crying could be heard over the radio. There was a menacing chorus rising in the static, something that was trying to push through. The human crying was so loud it was like a woman sobbing in the back seat, sobbing in my ear. I looked at the window with the larger deer, with the array of bloody streaks, and as the streaks seemed to take shape, the crying of the chorus grew louder. The streaks weren't just random nudges. It was drawing something. It was drawing a pentacle. With the last crude stroke that completed the crimson star and circle formation, there was a fog rising from the ditch on the side of the road. The mother doe buried her face into the lifeless fawn like it was trying to hide. Now that the crying had subsided, the chorus seemed clearer, and it hit me that it wasn't just singing or anything like that. It was screams. Horrible, tortured screams. Through the billowing fog, a wicked amalgamation of antlers jutted from the damp leaves and grass. With bright red rays, it tore through the earth, the sounds of 100 screaming souls droning over the radio as the rack poked through. The volume on the radio kept turning up. I covered my ears to thwart the punishing sound. The deer on both sides of me just stared in my anguish, the sound rising a pitch so great I thought the windshield would shatter. As the deer stared, I could see their faces began to shake, like a movie stuck on fast forward. Their eyes rattled in their skulls as their faces blurred, the speakers in the car whining under the strain of hopeless cries and pleas. The phalanx of antlers gave way to fur, wrapped around a skull bigger than a mouse. Through the cold mud it steamed in its ascent. Whether it was torn velvet or strips of flesh hanging from its points, I was not sure. They dangled like drying strips of meat. Beside me, the deer shook so fast their features distorted, some of them animal, others human. It matched the screams coming through the radio, as the full bust of shiny black fur was through the ground. The fog whispered away as if on fast forward as well. The head of the giant deer opened its eyelids to reveal two bleeding spheres the size of baseballs, its jet black pupils narrowing in on me. Cowering behind the steering wheel, I closed my eyes, wondering when I had started to scream. My scream blended with the others, one and the same. The screaming stopped. I sat there with my hands over my ears, my eyes squeezed shut, afraid to open them again. I heard the snort once again, and it was a moment before I gave in and looked in its direction. The large deer was still there, but it wasn't looking at me anymore. The screaming was gone. The bloody pentagram was gone. The mysterious fog and the shadowy black deer were gone. I lowered my hands to see the younger buck was looking as well, its ears fluttering with excitement. Not only were they not looking at me, they were walking away. Ahead of me, the fawn I had hit just minutes ago was blinking awake, confused and disoriented. After a struggle, it stumbled to its feet with the help of its mother. and weakly stood on its own after a few licks and prods with her nose. The large buck snorted and nodded at the baby, and after a moment of consideration, it nodded back. The large male gave an approving snort and turned to the mother, who nodded as well. I watched them in silence, not even sure what to do anymore. All at once they looked at me, a family of four, their mini glassy eyes reflecting in the headlights. I put my hands up in defeat. I couldn't help but stare back, my hands shaking as they huddled closer together. With a snort, the large male nodded, once at me, then once to the open road behind them. I didn't believe it. Slowly they moved together, giving me enough room to drive past them. I hesitated, but not for long. As soon as there was enough room, I let off the brake and started driving, creeping past the family herd as they watched me go. I gave an apologetic look at the baby, who returned it with twinkling eyes. As soon as I was clear of them, my foot pressed the accelerator and I got the hell out of there. Even though I was clear, I couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror behind me to make sure they weren't chasing me. I wish I would have just kept my eyes forward instead of behind me. They watched me go in silence, their dead stares unblinking as my car got further and further away. Just as they were almost out of sight, they stood up on their hind legs and one by one until they were all upright with their front legs at their sides. The mother and fawn looked away first, with the younger buck following close behind. The father stayed, however, his stare following until all I could see was an open stretch and trees behind me. I'm thinking some of you might not know what the woods in Louisiana are like, so let me help you. Take a normal, perfectly good, pleasant forest, add a little bit of poison ivy, a hell of a lot of boars and deer, and then as much mud as you can imagine. I'm talking metric fucking tons of the stuff. Every trail, every foot, everywhere. If you want to avoid pure foot blistering hell and the realm of all things mosquito, wait for a 2-week dry spell, and then try hiking. The mud will be gone and the mosquitoes won't be bad until dusk. But otherwise, wear jeans, wear a t-shirt, and suffer. And here's another little fun fact. It loves to rain. Loves to flood, too. So much, in fact, that our 57-acre property has a ramshackle levee that borders a stream to the north of our house. You normally couldn't drown it in if you tried, but the little shit gets higher than a stoner every time the sky gets so much as dribbles on us. You might be thinking that I don't like the rain, and you'd be right. For a good reason, trust me. Let's get to that in a second. So, this levee, right? 70 years old, as best as we can tell. Already here whenever we bought the property, and it keeps us high and dry. Without it, we'd basically have the vague outline roof of a house surrounded by an impromptu lake, followed by whatever piss-poor fish that actually live in the stream. As best as we can tell, there's a larger brook further up north than this creek branches off of, but it's just a small runoff route, thanks to a log jam, except for when it rains and the water bursts right past the jam and damn near drowns my house. But it doesn't. Thanks to one of the only useful pieces of redneck engineering to ever exist, our little rinky-dink-ass levee. Since my family's in the business of not choking on swamp water every time it rains, we check the levee after every bad storm. They come once, twice a month, or something like that. Sometimes back to back, sometimes once a year. Doesn't really matter. What does matter is that I'm one who gets sent out into the muddy hellscape that is our woods trail to check the damned bank whenever a storm passes. It's pretty much a routine at this point, but things get a bit weird sometimes. The woods have a lot of crazy shit in them. Old sheds and clearings no one's ever used. Car seats miles away from the nearest major road and hundreds of feet off the trail. Random piles of sheet metal and tire rims. Y'all get it. But every now and then, something new turns up, or gets uncovered, whatever you'd like to call it. Sometimes it's just an old water well that was covered up and it turns the concrete plug of whatever was sealing had just finally given out. And other times it's the remains of some poor family's stray trampoline. But last time was different. That's why I'm writing this. Consider this whole post a warning to anyone who likes poking around rural properties. Stay away from any drainage or runoff systems. Flash floods are real after a rain, and sure as hell real enough to bulldoze you into the nearest tree. But more specifically, avoid the levees. If you have to check them, wait until the mud dries up to look over them, until the sun beats down and the woods are as bright as can be. Don't wait till it's late, and the sun has a chance of setting, and don't fucking do it alone. Don't trust the levees. Last time I went out, it was creepy and quiet, which is pretty much the norm of the woods. You start to hear the bugs and the birds as time goes on, but they seemed a little slower to get revved up after this rain. Nothing to worry about. It was just a couple fallen trees, I thought. Unlucky, but expected. Water turns the dirt into mud, and the wind takes care of the rest, but usually the things are already half rotten, and blow down during the worst of it, which is why it was a little more concerning when I saw one fall down right in front of me. Contrary to popular belief, trees that have leaves and branches fall awfully slow. If you aren't right next to the base, so I had plenty of time to get clear, but it didn't bode well for me. I couldn't even imagine the last time a storm had been bad enough to knock down hardwoods like that, or the last time I had checked to see if our chainsaw worked. But it was work for another day. One less muggy and miserable, for damn sure. That was closer to the entrance of the tail leading to the levee, so I forgot about it pretty quickly after a few minutes of walking. You focus more on trying to find solid ground so you don't have to spend a few minutes pulling your feet out of a mud hole. Or 2, or 10. And then, there were the deer rubs. They're patches on younger saplings that backs rub the bark off of, sort of as a claim to the land, or maybe because their antlers itch. Hell if I know. My pa was the hunter. You might see one every now and then, but, well, everything looked dead, or dying. Deers wander in herds, sure, and you might see quite a few bucks around in hunting season. It was that time of the year, but it was like every male deer in a 50-mile radius had saw fit to scrape every inch of bark off of every tree they could reach. There were even a few broken nubs on the ground, with blood like they had rammed the older oaks, or fought each other. There was another weird thing. It wasn't even just the saplings. It was the pines and the water oaks and whatever else too, with the ground stamped to hell and back. If any hunters know anything about this, or hell, any arborists either, let me know. I'm just guessing at what happened, but there were tracks leading every which way, and the trees were more naked than, well, I'm running out of metaphors anyway. You get the gist. Exaggeration only goes so far. I'll cut to the chase. Shit got weird. Fast. It was supposed to be a 30-minute walk after that. It was a bend in the trail I took every trip, and I knew the way by heart. But I walked for at least a couple of hours, just plodding through the mud and swatting away the bugs. The trail never ended, and the sky never got dark. I even started marking trees to see if I was going crazy, but I never passed the same tree twice. The sky was starting to get dark. I had put the walk off until after an early supper, but I kept going. There wasn't much else to do since I had no idea where the hell I was. and I didn't have another 2 hours to spend doing the same way back. I figured I'd run into the levee eventually. It ran across the entire northern property line, a few hundred feet before our land actually ended, and I couldn't orient myself then and cut back across the property properly. But I never did. Another 30 minutes later, with me trying not to piss myself at every sound I was hearing in the trees, the trunks around me started to look different, blacker, darker than they should have been, even giving the setting sun. Diseased almost. Like they had rot, but the air smelled fine, still like it does after a rainstorm. I'd like to say I was a cool, calm, and collected son of a bitch, but I wasn't. I kept throwing glances over my shoulder and up at the sky and glancing at my phone occasionally. It was telling me it was 4:30. That gave me a little bit of a pause. It got dark around 5:30 or 5:40 at this time of year, and I must have left the house at 4, given that I ate supper and had to wash the dishes afterwards. But I was more worried about getting out than my phone bugging out, so I kept going. Running, even. That's when I heard it. It was a low rumble at first, like an earthquake or a train, but it just kept getting louder and louder, growing from behind me. When I turned around, I was facing directly down the length of the levee, the side to my left sloping away at a steep slant, the right just a mud plain going on for miles. And just around a bend about a mile down the glorified ditch, I could see something getting closer. Here I think my words are going to fail me. Maybe my fingers too. With the way they're shaking right now. Imagine staring down at a speeding train with your feet glued to the tracks, or a bull charging you while your shoelaces are tied together. Or something big and watery and beady-eyed, tearing down a concrete and mud trench that hurts to look at in a way you can't comprehend, stretching from right in front of you to the rightmost edge of the horizon. Yeah, it was mostly that last one, but I can't do it justice. It felt evil. I don't say this lightly. I grew up vaguely Christian, and if there was one thing Pa taught me, it's that evil is real and rare. It was his reason for being religious. He said he had stared down true evil in this world and could only cope by believing in true good. And that's the feeling that hit me. True evil, rolling off the damned thing like an oily smoke. It looked like a hunk of flotsam one moment, riding on a giant wave, and in another it was something long and muddy, with pincers and black eyes, like a crawfish ready to bite back. My feet were moving before I wanted them to, already bringing me towards the edge of the levee. It was impossible to climb up the thing normally, but one of the dark trees had branches of ivy trailing down its trunk, and one of these vines had continued on down the side of the levee. The other direction wasn't even a choice. There'd be no running in that, just tripping and slipping in the gunk. I don't know how fast that beast was going, but it covered the mile between us in less than a minute. I was barely on the bank when it blew past, sucking the air along with it, and nearly sending me tumbling back down the dip. It stunk like death where it had passed. Not sickly sweet, but rancid and rotting, like seafood baking under the sun for a week. It's hard to say what happened after that. I didn't stick around to find out if that thing could scale the banks of the levee. If it'd flood over like a rising tide and continue on its merry way. I just sprinted. For how long I was running and stumbling and cussing, I can't tell you, but eventually my foot snagged on something good and sent me tumbling down to the ground. I thought it was the pincer branch of the thing that nearly got me earlier, back to finish the job, but it was just a pile of sticks. Or rather, it was a pile of sticks now. It was hard to tell in the gloom, but it had definitely been something deliberately made before I smashed it. There were two halves of a square twig base, crudely tied together with a wooden figure of something laying on the ground next to me that must have been on some sort of platform or altar. Now, I don't know what you know about Cajun culture, but there's something called voodoo that we joke about. Black magic is what we mean, really, and I know that this probably wasn't real voodoo, that it was something else, by a more prim and proper name, but there's some superstitions, some hates that you can't just throw off. Voodoo was the first thing that popped into my head, fake enough when we were joking around, but less so when you're staring at a witch's doll. And then I crushed the damn thing beneath my heel as soon as I got up. Some things just feel right, and I didn't have any tinder with me to give the figure the proper scorching it deserved. After that, a relatively uneventful trip back to my house. It must have only taken 15 minutes to make it home, and the sky had been lightened a bit once I was out of the trees. Even after I had stopped running after my fall, when the black beast didn't come after me when I crushed the figurine, the talisman, whatever it was. I'm inside right now, in front of the fire I've built. I don't feel like being in the dark at the moment, and the heat helps me relax. But I can't help but wonder, the woods were never like that before. The levee never bordered a mudflat like that. It should have been more woods, calmer woods. Something was different. Or rather, something had changed it. My mind keeps going to that talisman or idol and witches and black magic. Tales about things lurking in the swamps and the bayous. Bedtime stories I wasn't supposed to hear as a kid. And I'm starting to wonder if me and my family are the only ones living on this land. One thing is for damn certain, though. I'm not checking the fucking levee next time. Walking tours are always a good idea. They're a great way to see a city, learn some local history, and particularly if you're a solo traveler, to meet people all on a budget. So when one of my old travel friends, Nils, decided to come visit me up in Edinburgh, I suggested we go on a ghost tour. I'd been on the tour several times before with my parents, when visiting before I'd moved here, and with several friends coming up for the fringe, so I knew it was a safe suggestion. The tour guides were usually very friendly and excellent actors, and the ghost stories were really just a mechanism to teach about the history of the city, which, in all its macabre, gory details set amongst Gothic spires and centuries-old smoke-blackened stone, was the perfect tone. When in the deep recesses of the ancient city, the plague victims, Edinburgh had a higher death rate than the birth rate for many years. Gang members and Highlanders crowded around small, fitful fires, roasting rats to survive a desperate escape from the bloody Highland clearances seemed not so far away, in time or in space. As a bit of a history nerd, I loved it, and I knew Nils, who'd shown me around most of Belgium, would love it too. A ghost tour? Is that where I get murdered in the dark and no one knows it was you? I promise it'll be fun. No stabbings. Maybe later on when we go out and lay, though. As long as I get to have a beer first. So it was decided. The week came around and he arrived without a hitch at the airport. We met at the train station and had a wander around the Christmas markets, sipping on mulled wine and daring each other to shoot for prizes. Eventually, we got cold, so wandered into the end of the world to warm up over a whiskey before heading to the tour. So what is this ghost thing? I didn't know you believed in ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts. I laughed at him. But it's a fun way to experience the history. They bring it to life a little bit more than some of the normal walking tours, and they take you underground to see the old city, which is pretty cool. To be honest, the scariest part is facing the ghosts of my own poor decisions right next to all the historical sites. But that can be a parallel tour in the meantime. He looked around at the walls of the pub, sipping his Lafroy. It is a historical city. I mean, not so different from many places in Europe, but it has a certain... It's very gothic. Yes, the architecture is very striking. I smile. To be honest, I don't believe in ghosts. But you start to get the feeling that if they do exist, there would be the place. Well, I don't know about that, but maybe your tour will change my mind. Drowning our whiskeys, I hastily rolled a cigarette, and we headed back out into the bitter wind, meeting our tour guide along Giles Girk. As the actors usually did, he dressed the part, a long black trench coat, dancing around heavy studded boots, red beard tied with a cord, and a look of mischief in his eyes. "Welcome to Scotland," he began. Leading us around the back of the church, he pointed before us. In medieval times, this kirk was the only one in Edinburgh. Due to religious practices at the time, all those who died had to be buried on consecrated ground. And back then, this was a relatively frequent occurrence. There was the Black Death, of course, not to mention the cholera, tuberculosis, smoke, crime, wooden buildings catching on fire, people drowning in sewage. It wasn't so common to leave your home one evening and never return. As you can imagine, after a while they started to run out of space. Nowadays, of course, it's all been paved over to make a car park for the lawyer's office just there. You know what they say about lawyers and souls. We went down the Royal Mile, him pointing out the winding, narrow alleyways and describing how the tall buildings would have been taller, half wooden, and prone to fire. That sewage had run in the streets downhill on both sides, although only legally to be tossed from the windows after 10 p.m. That the mile length of the city was enclosed by a thick wall of stone, which one needed to pay a toll to get in or out of, and so the city had simply grown up and up and up. Life would have been dwelt in the growing shadows of ever higher buildings, the skyscrapers of the era, in smoke, and the sounds of madness and revelry echoing on stone. Here, death walked hand in hand with life, and often shared a drink or two. We paused between two right-hand turns. One broad road leading flat across a bridge to the rest of the old town. The other a narrow winding path dipping sharply downwards to the valley below. In case you haven't noticed, Edinburgh is built on a hill, which was fairly convenient, for the most part. All the waste drained downwards. However, the road below us used to be the market entry to the city, and all the wealthy merchants didn't like wading through the muck, so they had the brilliant idea to build a bridge over it. He pointed to the wide road lined with gleaming shops to one side, then began to lead us down the winding alleyway on the other. They convinced the merchants, workshop owners, nobility, and the like to fund the building of the bridge, and in exchange, they would be able to live in houses on top of it, and run their businesses from the rooms inside. He stopped at a black wooden door set in the high stone wall of the solid bridge to our right, hidden in shadow. These are what we call the vaults. By this point, we were most excited to get inside to escape the cold. The temperature rarely dropped below 0 Celsius here, but the wind carried a bitter chill not held entirely at bay by our drams from earlier. What would bring the ghosts here, you may ask? He smiled. Come inside, and I'll show you. We barely spared a second glance for the outside world before plunging into the black cave in the side of the city. Our guide switched a flashlight on beneath his chin, waving us into a circle around him. Well, the merchants and the like were all thrilled by this idea. After all, real estate was scarce in those days. The reality proved to be underwhelming. He pointed the flashlight upward, and the stone arches not far above us. Tendrils of some sort of ossification trailed down towards us like stone cobwebs. What they failed to take into consideration was that, well, this being Scotland, it rains. The bridge was hardly waterproof, and very quickly the mortar between the stones began to melt, making those strange mineral formations you see up there. The damp crept in, and the legitimate businesses fled, leaving room for the less reputable. Eventually, the city had to fill in these caverns to reduce the body smuggling, deaths, disappearances, nefarious characters, etc. It's only in the last 50 years or so we have begun to re-excavate these tunnels and found the remains of it all. Not just the bodies, of course, although some of those too. He led us from room to room, downstairs and through pitch black hallways winding between rock and rubble. A few standard jokes, some tales of nefarious ghost sightings. And here's where people often felt a chill. Ooh. And the reassurance that no one would be jumping out at us, because it wasn't terribly COVID safe, and also the tour company had realized it saved them money. Sighs of relief all around. The claustrophobia was a bit stifling, and I found myself having to take some deep breaths to calm down. I looked over at Nils to make sure he was doing all right. A smirk drifted on his face, and his arms were crossed as he looked skeptically at the tour guide. I made my way to stand next to him. "Believe in ghosts yet?" I teased, whisper muted by the shuffling of the group. Wait, I think I felt a chill just then. We're underground and it's freezing. He laughed as we moved to the next room. Before we had left the narrow corridor, however, the tour guide paused. In the flashlight cast upward towards the features, I could almost make out a calculating look, like he was deciding whether to let us in on a secret. I've told you of many ghosts who dwell in this place, but there are some we don't know about. As we excavate more, we find new things, some more macabre than others. We just opened up a new level. Don't worry, it's been cleared out of all the gross stuff. Normally we can't go in, but they're opening it for the tour in a few weeks anyway. And it's the last tour of the evening, so perhaps tonight we'll have a preview. And with that, he swung open a near invisible door to our left and guided us down a downward sloping floor for some meters before coming to a stop at a steep drop. The tip of a ladder peeking up over the edge. I wouldn't make anyone come down this way if they don't like, but you look like a fairly adventurous crew. Shall we? I looked at Nils, who was starting to seem excited. Thoughts? Who doesn't like a sneak preview? Similar muttered conversations were going on around us. There were maybe 8 people altogether, including our guide, and quickly a consensus was reached. And so, one by one, stifling our inhibitions for the sake of novelty, we followed him down into the darkness. The room we entered was clearly less trafficked than the one above us. There was more rubble, few tools scattered about, and a slightly putrid edge to the otherwise normal musty odor of old stone buildings. He led us between the piles, pointing out tanning equipment discovered here and cow skull found there and piles of rat remains here. We don't know why so many tangled together at the tail. Despite being so far underground, the air down here seemed to move. Not like a fresh breeze from outside, but a restless shifting of stale oxygen. I felt a rush of anxiety partnered by a sweaty flush over my skin, and realized the drop of nicotine withdrawal was starting to kick in. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. How long have we been down here for anyway? So, wrapped up in the hankering of my next fix, I didn't notice the sounds of the group slowly changing, as though we were underwater. Looking around, I realized the light of the torch was drawing farther away, flickering yellow as they turned a corner. I gasped for air that now seemed scarce and stumbled towards them in the dark, reaching out a desperate hand as my foot caught on a jagged piece of stone and felt myself falling. My fingers brushed fabric, and when there were more hazy moments before I could hear the whispered voices of concern around me, felt hands lifting me up and was helped forward. Nils? I mumbled. Who's Nils? Tall, Belgian guy? I came on the tour with him. There is no Nils. You came here alone. A chill crept up my spine. I felt something brush against my cheek and gasped at its coldness, like black ice. Squinting in the hazy, flickering light, I couldn't make out the faces, but they seemed to be familiar. Someone took my hand and led me forward. What happened to the lights? I can't see. The last light. Now you see it. A stale gust of wind blew past my face, a low, drawn-out groan accompanying it. Now you don't. The lights went out, and the dark was filled with screaming. It took them 3 days to find me, apparently, wandering beneath the city. One of the other people on the tour happened to notice I was missing. No one could remember the tour guide's name, and he was seemingly nowhere to be found. And no one remembered Nils. I swore up and down that he must also be trapped inside the tunnels. Offered our ticket receipts as proof. Showed them his bag of things still in my living room. I didn't understand the look in their eyes until I realized they weren't sure if I was crazy. But every time I opened my phone to show them, a blinding headache would obscure my vision and I'd need to lay down. These scenes are fading. They come and go like a dream, sometimes in hyper-realistic color, sometimes fuzzy and faded like the old cotton of curtains in forgotten windows. Sometimes I wonder if they even found me, or if I'm still beneath the city wandering alone in the dark. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. Sometimes when I lay with my mind drifting, I feel the cold touch of black ice raise goosebumps on my sides. There are moments if I stare too long at someone's face, the shadows on it will begin to move, stretching, reaching until their eyes disappear into darkening sockets, teeth stretching into vengeful grins. Now you see it. I will jolt back to reality, the voice echoing in my mind. Now you don't. Please help. I don't know if I'm even writing this, or if I'm imagining it. Today I woke up in the dark, laying on cold stone with dirt beneath my fingernails, and it was only the tolling of a church bell which seemed to bring in sunlight. I am always out wandering the city's paths, but no one seems to notice me. Not since I've been found. I've seen no one I know, heard no familiar voices. Or are they all familiar? I am lost, I think. I don't remember going to sleep, and I don't remember when was the last time I was touched by anything but icy fingers in the dark. And everywhere I go is shadow, and the sounds of madness and revelry echoing off the stone until it fills my mind and I cannot help but join in. What's happening to me? The following is an excerpt from a notepad found in the back of a heavily damaged and weathered TTC, Toronto Transit Commission bus that went missing in August 2019. The bus was found on the coast of Hudson's Bay, north of Attawapiskat First Nation, over 1,000 kilometers from Toronto in early 2021. All I can do now is distract myself through writing. I don't know if waiting it out is my only option, or if I should do something drastic. With every second that passes, I can't help but think that this bus will be my tomb either way. I don't feel that I'm pressed for time. In fact, I feel oddly soothed. I'll write a bit of backstory for perspective. Like many other city-living commuters, waiting for the bus was a fairly common occurrence to me. The trains didn't run early in the morning when I went to work. Often enough, I'd check the app, which said the same thing as the bus stop schedule. The bus would be arriving imminently, 1 to 2 minutes. 1 minute would pass, then 2, then 3. It's not infrequent that the city buses are late, with no real explanation as to why. What's rare, however, is when they simply don't arrive at all. I'd check my app over and over again, only to find that allegedly the bus had come and gone. News to me and the other 2 people waiting, as the roads were quiet and there's no way we could have missed it. I jokingly referred to these buses as eldritch buses. Little did I truly know. Although not a totally common occurrence, it wasn't anything I'd ever given a second thought to, beyond fuming about being late. Typically I'd brush it off as the same crap transit service I grew up with in Toronto. At first, I'd cuss and see the same displeasure reflected back at me in the faces of the other impatient commuters, as they, too, would check their phones in vain. I had no cause to care beyond my wasted time. That is, until I ended up seeing what happened to those missing buses. Today, I got on the bus as normal, around 5 a.m. on a Sunday. It was that late point in summer, when the days are hot and humid, but the early hours of the morning are cool. There tends to be quite a bit of fog, and you see the condensation is formed on the windows of quiet cars and dark storefronts. As the bus rolled up, I saw the yellowish-white glow of the fluorescent lights through the moisture-laden windows, piercing the darkness like a dull knife. The driver had that vacant end-of-the-shift look on his face. He probably wouldn't have noticed whether or not anyone who got on even paid their fare. As I stepped up to board, the only other person waiting with me shoved past rudely, desperately for a seat, likely to pass out and miss their stop. I didn't think much of it. It was too early to really kick up a stink anyway. Strangely, the bus was far less occupied than usual. In fact, there was only one other passenger on it. As the trains don't operate at this time, it's rare that I would see an open seat, let alone snag one. I didn't really care much about the why. I was just happy to get a rare, coveted seat for my, as of yet, caffeinated arse. I sat near the back, so as to keep the way clear for new people coming on. The bus trotted along as usual through the dark August morning. I tried to look out the windows as I tend to get motion sickness easily, but unfortunately, due to the condensation, I was out of luck. I dared to look down at my phone only to realize the commute that should have taken 20 minutes had been going for almost 30. Frustrated, I checked the app to see the expected time of arrival at my stop. 3 minutes. Not much I could have done other than stew in my anger. 5 minutes later, I checked once more. 3 minutes again. Absolutely furious at this point, I stood up to gripe at the driver, but realized the bus wasn't moving at all. We weren't stopped at a light, so far as I could tell, but it felt like the bus wheels were in motion. The engine was working hard, as if desperately trying to accelerate, but we were definitely not moving. I looked back down at the app on my phone. 0 minutes. Then it started to display the time for the next bus, as if we'd glided straight through the stop. I ran up to the front of the bus to get the driver to let me off immediately, but stopped as I noticed something incredibly peculiar. I couldn't see a single thing through the front window. I hadn't paid any attention to the front windows until then, but there was no way in hell the driver could see through all the thick, creamy mist, and yet the engine was still roaring. As I turned to the driver, I noticed he was unconscious, foot off the pedal. I tried to shake him awake, but he wouldn't rouse. He was stiff and cold. If it wasn't for the wisps of breath I saw emerging from his slacked mouth, I'd have been convinced he was dead. I turned around to voice my concerns to the other two passengers, but saw they too were out cold. All thoughts of getting to work on time had completely gone out the window. Fumbling for my phone, I tried to make a call. Someone, anyone, as I tried to call my wife's number. The call failed. No service. Out of options, but struggling in futility, I tried calling again. No luck. As I stood there, attempting to think of what to do next, I pondered, why have I not tried to leave the bus? I suppose it was because I was a little bit scared. There was a haunting nag of uncertainty in the back of my mind, a fear of dealing with the unknown all alone. Pressing my palm against the window of the bus door, it was cool, far too cold to have matched the ambient temperature when I first left my home. By now it was almost 6:30 a.m. If anything, it should be warming up outside. I forced the front folding door open, only to be overwhelmed with a vile, acrid scent. The vicious, almost gelatinous fog started to pour in. Desperately, I slammed the door closed as quickly as I could, gagging and choking on the permeating air. I raced back to my previous seat and put my head in my hands. What the hell do I do now? I tried to reason with myself that this was some kind of delusion. A dream, but the stinging feeling in my sinuses from the fog reassured me that I was very much awake, although I definitely was starting to feel drowsy, more so than normal during my early commute. I knew I had to fight the urge to sleep. I was the only one on the bus who somehow managed to maintain consciousness. Every time my eyelids felt too heavy to bear, and I'd almost lose the fight against unconsciousness, I'd hear the faintest whisper come from all around me. It'd spook me halfway back to attention. As my eyelids felt heavier and heavier, the whispers losing their shock value, I thought for sure I was done resisting. Then I heard a huge thump. The bus rocked back and forth. Against the window next to the rude dude who shoved me earlier, I saw there was damage to the glass from a significant impact. A web-like ripple, but strangely obscured. Upon further inspection, there was some kind of fluid or slime on the exterior of the glass. As I slowly moved closer to examine it, another massive thump sent me reeling backwards. Whatever it was, it hit like a baseball bat or a golf club. It didn't look like anything I knew, though. It looked like a fat, flattened hose. I only saw it for a second, but it was enough to know there was something out there. Whatever the hell it was. It was trying to get the rude guy. I worked up my courage, ran up, grabbed him, and dragged him to the back. No more thumps so far. I decided to do the same with all the other occupants. The back area was much harder to see into from the outside, as the windows are much smaller. Hopefully whatever was out there would simply give up. I checked my watch. It was 7:30 at this point. No thumps since I dragged everyone to the back. I decided to look around, maybe see if I could make out something else in the fog. I noticed something dark against the window on the left-hand side. Hesitant to approach the windows too closely, I tried to study it from afar. It looked like a big mouth, like one of those fish that suck the glass in fish tanks. I don't remember what they call them. A sucker mouth catfish? Except this had several rows of and a massive body, more like an overgrown lamprey, as if they weren't creepy enough at their normal size. Wondering what the hell to do now? Not wanting to attract any more attention to the bus, I remembered my notepad in my bag. I pulled it out and began to write all of this down, to help distract myself and to stay calm. I watched the mysterious leech for a while between thinking of all the details to add to my writings. I've lost track of time. I still feel torn between feeling like I'm going to pass out and being too jacked up on pure terror to sit. I looked again into its maw. It was almost hypnotic. The rows of teeth were orchestrated very strangely, almost like a psychedelic spiral, but dark and macabre. It became difficult to look away. Another huge crash interrupted my gaze into the abyss. Something huge collided with the bus, rocking it back and forth. Worse than the previous thumps. Something big, bigger than the lamprey, slammed right on top of it and snatched it away. I couldn't see at all what it was, but all that was left behind was a smear of whatever juices ran through the lamprey's body, and another huge web-like crack in the glass, only this one looked more severe. It wasn't until I smelled that sour, stinging scent again that I took notice. The fog was seeping in through the cracks. It was only a matter of time before the bus would be filled. I had no idea what I could use to block it. I rifled through my backpack and the belongings of my unconscious bus mates with very little luck. The driver had some cheap chewing gum in his rear pocket. Better than nothing. I put every piece in my mouth and started to hastily chew. I then attempted to smear the sticky goo over as much of the cracks as I could. It now caught up to the present moment in my writing. The whispers have come back. They make it hard to write. I wish I could understand what they were saying. By now, I can tell that it's brighter outside the bus. The fog has a gooey off-white appearance, almost a little purple. I hadn't even noticed at what point the bus engine had stopped, but the lights inside are off now. I just looked up from my writing, only for a second. What I saw briefly paralyzed me. There are shadows in the fog, all sorts of strange figures, ranging in size from the average human to that of an elephant, some of indescribable shapes. It feels like the bus is surrounded by these shadows on all sides. Like a cockroach scurrying for sanctuary, I'm now sitting partially under the seats, next to my unconscious companions. To whatever these creatures are, I am little more than a fearful insect, hiding for dear life. Everything just got significantly brighter. The bus is jostling. It feels like an earthquake. I see the previous shadowy forms edging away out front. The light begins to dim. I had to pause from writing for a few minutes. It was too dark to see my page. We were in the shadow of something massive, but it's past now. The mist has eaten away at the gum-sealed crack. It's making its way in again. I don't know if I hope that someone finds this notepad, or if I'd rather that no one ever knows about this hellish dimension I've fallen prey to. I can see the shadows moving again in the distance. Closing in, moving faster. The whispers are so loud now, like screams, but I still can't understand. I want to understand. I have no hope here. In this place. I'm so lonely, but I don't feel as scared as I did before. If anyone finds my writing, finds themselves trapped as I am, don't be scared. It gets easier. I'm going to try to leave through the emergency exit hatch on the roof of the bus. Maybe it will give me a vantage. I need to get out of there. I don't know why, but I think that's what the whispers want. I think they're trying to help me. I don't remember why I was afraid anymore. I don't really remember what fear felt like. All of the damages reported in the notepad are consistent with the condition of the bus, with the exception of many additional signs of impacts not present in the aforementioned log.